My name's Warren Hunt. I'm the Industry Development and Extension Leader with the Northern Territory Department of Resources. That's equivalent to DPI, Department of Agriculture. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania, commencing in 2010. So I'm hoping to, I've got 7 papers in this compendium so far, and I've got a last one to fit into the thesis. So, but I thought I'd give an update on some work that I've had published in recent times, in league with Colin Birch and Frank Vanclay, and also Jeff Coots from Queensland. I'm going to talk about agricultural extension. I'm not sure if too many of you would be familiar with what agricultural extension is. Extension basically is the interface between the research and development and the end user, which is farmers, graziers, service providers, that sort of thing. But the angle which I'm going to pursue is this is very much a philosophical paper, this first presentation. I'm giving 2 this afternoon. This is about looking back and observing whether there's any particular trends or ebbs and flows in the way agricultural investment has been undertaken in Australia. When I say that investment, I mean agricultural RD&E investment in Australia. Research, development and extension. I'm focusing on extension, but we really can't separate them. They are symbiotic creatures. So this is titled The Many Turnings of Agricultural Extension in Australia. So we're going to analyse some of the trends in RD&E. Now, my academic supervisors hit me between the eyes and said, I've got to come up with some sort of framework. So I looked high and I looked low. I'd created this terrific dissertation, a great story about the history of agriculture in Australia after my research. But basically that's what it was. It was just a big story. But what's it actually mean? How do we actually interpret that? So I looked high and looked low. And I found 2 authors, Strauss and Howe, 1998. Has anyone ever heard of Strauss and Howe? Okay. Fourth Turning, the book Generations. Okay. Well, these guys are American historians, and they've studied 500 years of Anglo-American history. And they believe that there's definitive and temporally repetitive patterns in the way in which our society ebbs and flows. And now my assumption is, it's a very bold assumption, that Australia is also a subset of, or an add-on to Anglo-American society. We have our Anglo roots and we have a strong American influence. And agriculture is a subset of the society we live in. Now, for research people or people involved in the business of agriculture, that might sound a bit strange, because to us, that's our world. We live and breathe it. And so we feed and we clothe the planet. Well, the reality is we're the subset of a society. We're a component. I'm going to talk about something called turnings. It's not my idea. This is Strauss and Howe, these historians. Now it's their perspective that there's 4 turnings within what they call a saculum, or the lifespan of a human being, providing you lead a full life, 80 to 100 years. So 4 turnings that usually occur. They could be 20 to 30, 25 years in space and time and space. The 4 turnings represent a seasonal rhythm or periods. Firstly, where there's an exposure to intense challenge, where there's an opportunity for growth, where there's a maturation of society, and then a point where there's maximum entropy. And they also link this with generational change. Now, I'm not going to go into generational change, okay, because they talk about archetype generations and how they behave during these different turnings. But it will get a bit of a mention later. Okay, the turnings. Now, crisis. That's a pretty straightforward definition, but during a crisis turning, it's a period where you get a lot of upheaval and everything comes under threat. The whole fabric of society comes under threat. And a sense of urgency drives the need to develop institutions to counter that. It leads on to the next turning, which is what's called a high. Now, this is an upbeat period where you get the strengthening of the institutions that have been created during the crisis. You see growth in society, you see expansion, and as a consequence, there's prosperity. You know, like the crisis period, I'll talk about our crisis periods in a minute and our high periods, but you'll work it out. The awakening. It is a period where new ideas emerge. These institutions have come forth, they've generated this wealth, this knowledge, this capacity, and from that a whole lot of ideas flow. Both good ideas and possibly some negative ideas too. The good ideas take root and so do the negative ones. And some of the negative ones sometimes lead to the next turn, an unravelling period, which is where institutions are degraded and the older order decays. Then after that, we go back to a period of crisis. There's a confrontation. Okay. Now I'm going to equate that to Australian agriculture in terms of the research, development and extension story. Now, Australian agriculture, in terms of RD&E, commences back in the 1860s, and this first turning, this first period is what I'm calling the late-colonial crisis. Australia was challenged at that point with the gold rushes and a large amount of both prospectors coming to this place with regards to the gold rush, as well as free settlers coming from Europe and the Americas. And the thing is, we didn't really know much about how to grow food in this country. It was all a bit alien. It was a different operating environment. Now, the colonial governments then looked to the British model, as they would, and began to develop departments of agriculture within their administrations. By the late 1880s, we'd seen the emergence of research stations, regulatory officers, and they say itinerant instructors, which we now call extension personnel, people working in that role. So these research farms were established. The government led the effort because they feared that the private sector wouldn't have the capacity to do so, and they were probably right. Now, the climax of this period was when the wheels really fell off. We had widespread losses due to wheat rusts in Australia in the late 1880s, and that basically meant that we had to import grain. It was quite a severe situation for this young developing nation. Now, for those of you, can anyone tell me who that bloke is? Farrer, William Farrer. What's he responsible for? The development and widespread adoption of hybrid wheats in the early 20th century. He was at the vanguard of the Federation High. During that crisis, the institutions were set up. He was at his research station out around Canberra. He developed these wheats. In this period, we saw also the establishment of agricultural schools, or the old ag colleges as we call them, initially in South Australia and Victoria, and New South Wales and Queensland. And this was driven by a political imperative for land reform. If we had to feed this nation, we had to get the good arable country off the pastoralists, and so there were reforms to break that up. There was also an imperative in terms of the British democratic tradition, which was they didn't want to go back to a feudal society. So those from the Liberals back then in the British definition of politics broke up the mandate of the pastoralists, and farmers were brought in. So now, at that point, extension, as we know it, was basically generation of the science, and then going out and telling farmers how to do things. So it was relied on what we call technology transfer techniques. So we advanced as a nation in agriculture. Universities were established, agricultural faculties, and they started to feed people into our RD&E system. We had the first soldier settlement schemes in the coming out of the First World War. They were created during the First World War. In 1926, we had the CSIR, not CSIRO, the CSIR it was known then, for undertaking scientific research, both industrial and agricultural. And the whole mission was land development, settlement, improvement, production technologies, pest and animal disease control. Really good basic science. However, what follows an awakening period is an unravelling period. Declines in the Great Depression come along. The good ideas that came out of the previous period, the awakening, would stand us in good stead, but some bad ideas come out of it too as society. The bad idea was neoclassical economics, anyway, and that led to the Great Depression. So we saw declines in agricultural commodity prices in Australia. We had price support systems that were put in place by government to try and keep people on the land. Just remember, there were a lot of people on the land at that point as compared to nowadays. And there was widespread rural protest and militancy. Who could imagine farmers being militant? State government basically stagnated in its RD&E effort, austerity measures. A review of the pre-war and World War II agricultural, what do you call it, response, or how Australian agriculture functioned during that time was committed by a fellow called Crawford. And he states that the state funds and facilities available for technical research and extension of farming were inadequate for a country so dependent on its rural industries. So there were deficiencies and failures in soldier settlement schemes. We know that. We saw rabbit plagues as well. We had prickly pear outbreaks. And all of this would have detrimental consequences during the coming war years. Basically, can anyone see any of this happening now? Yeah, sort of. You see where I'm heading? World War II. Beginning of World War II, it was business as usual because the war was over there. It was in North Africa. We basically produced a set of commodities that the British Empire could utilise. However, that all changed. That all changed by 1942. There was a renewed sense of urgency. Japan had entered the war. Australia was under threat of invasion. Now, in terms of the manpower, it had either been conscripted or volunteered into military service. So we basically had a diminished labour force and a diminished intelligentsia in terms of the technical skills for agriculture. And on top of that, we had another 700,000 largely American forces in the Pacific that we had to contribute food and fibre products for. That did lead to innovation. Okay, they did strengthen the institutions, but they also came up with some innovation, which was 144 district war agricultural committees, which is basically a bottom-up approach to resource allocation as well as how to priorities in research, development and extension. This was the only thing that had been done from the bottom-up approach up till then, and sadly after World War II we went back to the old top-down technology transfer process. After that, when the war came out on the top side of it, we went through a high period, right through into the 70s. Now you know this story because it's the Green Revolution. Australian governments, both state and federal, invested heavily in agricultural RD&E, and we see the legacy for that. We had a very skilled and capable agricultural workforce. We saw land development schemes, second soldier settlement schemes, much more successful than number one. We saw university graduates entering into the extension business. That wasn't just a sort of add-on. There was a discrete discipline that was being created. And we also saw academic research and training in the extension field. Then we had an awakening period. Our institutions are strong, wealth and prosperity, more challenges, sustainability, land management. We got into that business. We had complex issues to resolve. The simple issues were being sorted, but how to mesh economic and social and science issues all together. It required another approach. That's where extension very much came into the fore with regards to the awakening period. We went to facilitative styles of extension. bottom-up styles of extension. We saw the development of institutions specifically targeting that train of thought, and I mentioned Hawkesbury Agricultural College, which is now University of Western Sydney, the Gatton Rural Extension Centre, which is was a part of the University of Queensland. And yeah, this went through into the early 90s, and basically government agencies were embracing this approach. And I call it was the high watermark of what we've achieved in Australian agriculture was up into the early 1990s. We had the science, we had the capacity, we had the technology, and we had the means to deliver it in terms of extension skill. What happens next? Today's unravelling, the mid-1990s to present day. The 80s and 90s were big public policy reform periods. Now, we can't underestimate this report, the Balderstone Report 1982, which saw a deregulation of Australian agriculture in terms of the way in which commodities were controlled in terms of production, as well as in terms of the way in which they were sold. There were barriers to entry into different industries, there were quota systems, there were set price schemes, there were single desk selling arrangements. All that went. We became one of the most deregulated agricultural sectors in the world. On top of that, the government said to rural industry, you will contribute. The federal government said, you will contribute. And the research and development corporations and the CRCs, cooperative research centres, were set up. Now, standing on the sideline of the state governments, and they saw all this happening and they thought, well, okay, industries are getting involved, they're contributing, the feds are getting involved, we can start to relocate our resources into other areas in our economies other than agriculture. We don't need to be in this space. And since the 90s that's been the case, and it's continuing. Okay, what that has resulted in is, in terms of agricultural departments and that sort of thing, is short-term tenures and downgrading of professionalism. We don't have the capacity like we used to. There's problems with recruitment and lack of career paths. People are not going to university like they used to do agriculture because there's less job opportunities on the other end. When I went to Gatton College in 1987, 120 students in first year between horticulture, rural technology and rural management. Then there was the University of Queensland St Lucia as well. So you're probably looking at 500 or 600 people in an agricultural course between the two institutions. Now, if there's 40 people between the two institutions, you're doing pretty well. Big difference, because there's no job opportunities on the other end. Okay, 21st century, the change continues. Ongoing withdrawal of both the state and territory government agencies to invest in agriculture. So what's the next turning? Come on, what's the next turning? It's crisis. The coming crisis. And it's, okay, I'm only saying this because there's other people who plotted history and saying, well, okay, right, in Anglo-American society, this is bound to be what's going to happen. Firstly, I don't know what the next crisis is going to be. And secondly, I'm not a prophet, I can't predict the future. But there are repetitive historical patterns that we cannot ignore. And basing around what these guys are saying, they link the turnings to generations. Right? And we're at about that generational turn now. And these guys in the 90s predicted that America would enter their next crisis in the mid to late 2000s. And where you want to start? 2008? Let you have to think about that. The next crisis. Previous crises that we've struck were driven by either food security issues, an urgency to generate wealth, regional development and or war effort. Similar forces could again be the drivers. What the crisis might be is speculative. World food shortages and soaring food prices. Exotic animal disease, plant disease. Our plant gene pool is narrowing somewhat in terms of the major commercial varieties out there, and if we were unfortunate enough, we could find ourselves in a very sticky situation with plant disease. Water scarcity, extended droughts, overcrowding in major cities, energy shortage and impact on food production and supply chains, competition with resource industries, and regional global conflict scenarios. Imagine if the Persian Gulf was shut down in the next month. See what would happen around the world. Conclusions. So history indicates that a coming future crisis will instigate reinvestment in agricultural RD&E in Australia. However, I'd like to point out that it's my opinion that the return to the old public sector model is highly unlikely, simply because in most cases it doesn't exist anymore. They've been either severely degraded or those particular agencies don't exist. Public sector investment should focus, though, if we're going to do this again, on where the commercial stakeholders are unable or unwilling to deliver because of market realities. In terms of the public policy people, there needs to be a recognition that the market can't do everything. It cannot do everything. Market forces, the private sector does very well with this immediate private sector return. They don't necessarily do well on the harder, longer term or more strategic issues. And we need to have a very hard think about our current RDC-CRC model in terms of whether it's sustainable, particularly with the exit of the public sector at its increasingly rapid rate, because they have actually been the capacity for the RDCs and the CRCs to enter real industry and make change in real industry, and that capacity is eroding rapidly. If you want some further reading, that's it. I've got a copy of that particular paper here.